28 and 29, if you'd like to read along. They did eat, they drank, they married wives. They were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark and the flood came. And destroyed them all. Likewise also as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. May the Lord bless the reading of his word.
This morning, I don't know how many people like history to a certain extent, and I also like, as I call it, history with a face. If I can put history and correlate it to someone, it makes it much more interesting. And this morning, we're going to look at a little history, if you will, because as we talk about Jesus in the New Testament, tells us remember Lot's wife as an example of maybe something not to do. But in order to understand the complete picture, I think we have to go back a little bit. And I want to start back where we find first Lot and Abraham and Terah and all of those mentioned. And it's interesting, as I was looking at this, the times that this is occurring when Abraham first receives his call and Lot too. It's around this about 2000 BC. And as I was looking, I wondered, well, who else would be living in that time? Who would be a contemporary of? And as I looked, it said Noah probably died 2 to 3 years before Abraham was born, but Shem, the son of Noah, would have been alive for probably most of Abraham's life, and also somewhere in that time frame, or close to it, either Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, would have been Job, living not too terribly far away. And the Bible doesn't necessarily correlate how close they were or where Shem was living, but as I read that, I thought, it makes for some interesting questions, doesn't it, that one of these days we're going to get to ask. Maybe we'll get to ask some questions more about what Shem knew about Abraham. And even when you find that people don't interact, we find later on in the life of Abraham, he realizes what's going on. He realizes that his relatives have, children and grandchildren that are back up in the land that he left. So somehow this information gets through, and we don't know exactly what took place. But as we look at the time, one of the first things I wanted to look at was it talks about Abraham and his father Terah, where they first came from was Ur of the Chaldees. And I've read just a little bit, but I thought I want know just a little bit more about this area that they were called out from. And as I was reading, it was talking about, it said, a century ago, there were those who questioned even if Abraham was a real person. Thinking, well, this is just a story. This is just one of those things that we've got there as maybe as Loris would have said, an allegory. Not a real person, but just something to give us a moral guide, if you will. But as they've done excavations, in fact, in 1922, it said Leonard Woolley was one of the first to excavate the area. And one of the things they found out, this was a wealthy trading and manufacturing center renowned for its textile industry. And as they started excavating, they found out the town was connected by a series of canals, not only for watering this area, but also for commerce. They said commerce as far away as India. They were receiving spices and things from India, gold from Egypt. This was a trading center, and it was an area of fairly high sophistication. Said, at the time of the Romans, we seem to be surprised that they had, if you will, indoor plumbing and sewage systems, but Ur did. And they talked about, in fact, as they found some of the tablets, they found out that the kids there were quite well educated. And quite likely, Abraham and Lot both would have been educated too. And you say, well, what would they have learned? Well, mathematics, engineering, a lot of the things that we were writing cuneiform. One of the interesting things I found, and evidently people haven't changed too much, some of these cuneiform tablets that these young students were using to learn to write also had doodles on them. Anybody doodle in school? Well, I looked, thought, well, 4,000 years ago, kids were still doodling even back then. But it said this was a very sophisticated city and with a high level of what we would call the arts and architecture. The homes were well built, would have had a bathroom inside, some, and we would think 4,000 years ago, surprisingly, but had indoor plumbing with an indoor toilet. Maybe even had running water, they're theorizing. So they were also quite sophisticated even in the ways of medicine. They've actually found prescription tablets, if you will. They were aware of salicylic acid, what we would call aspirin. They used honey and alcohol for antiseptics. They had a variety of things that they were quite knowledgeable about. And so we find that this area that Abraham came from was, you might say, it was the sophisticated area of his day. With a high level of learning, it was an area that had a lot of trade. If you lived there, you could, like maybe today, you say, well, you get on Amazon, you can get almost anything around the world. Well, you could get just about anything that came from a wide variety around. But had one other thing that probably wasn't so good going for it, and that was it had a polytheistic, there my tongue goes tied, multiple gods that they worship, but each city had one in particular that was kind of their god. And for the city of they said they were dedicated to the moon god Nana, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but in the center of the city was a 100-foot ziggurat, and on top of that was a temple to the god of Nana. And certainly there were other gods that were worshipped there. And as we read in Joshua 24:2, here we find Joshua talking to the people of Israel, and he said to the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods." So Abraham grew up in a family. Here he was in this sophisticated city we might call one of maybe the New York or London or Paris of its day, a very sophisticated. If you wanted the arts, if you wanted the best of medicine, if you wanted education, this was the place to be. But it was also a place of idol worship. And we find that the Bible tells us that Abraham's father had fallen, if you will, victim to that too. Even though he knew about the real God, the God of heaven, he was also worshiping some of these other gods. And so now with that background, we start to understand why in the beginning of Genesis that the call comes to, and at first it talks about Abraham's father and Abraham leaving to go to the land of Canaan. And certainly we think, we know the call came to Abraham, but we can imagine Abraham maybe did a little arm twisting, and of course his dad was not totally against that, so they set out, heading out for the land of Canaan. And as we look at that, I want to just call a quick bit of attention to those who go. And it says, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abraham, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abraham and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milchiah, and the father of Isaac. But Sarah was barren, and she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah's daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came into Haran and dwelt there. One of the things I wanted to take a look at, because I think it plays a part in where this all goes, we're talking about Lot's wife, but as we read here, we find no indication that Lot's married. As they leave the Mesopotamia and they start heading for Canaan, there's no wife mentioned for Lot. And I think it's important, and I'll point that out a little bit later, but they're very careful in mentioning who's there. They mention the sons, they mention their wives, they mention all these people. Lot's mentioned, but there's no wife mentioned for Lot. And so it says they set out for the land of Canaan, but as they go on their way, when they come to the land of Haran, we're not really told for sure, but evidently Terah's an older man by this time. And as they stop there, maybe for a little bit of recuperation, you can see the land of Haran was very much like Ur. In fact, people have said that they worship the same moon god that they did in Ur. And so perhaps that was the draw for his father Terah to stop, and maybe wanted to recuperate a little bit. But anyway, we know that while they were there, Terah dies. And it says at the end of this, at this time frame here, that the Lord said unto Abram, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house." This is in Genesis 12, and starting in verse 2. "And unto a land I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him who curseth thee, and in thee shall the families of the earth be blessed." So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abraham took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all the substance they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and went forth to the land of Canaan, and it says, and into the land of Canaan they came. Now, one of the things that I noticed there is that God's call is not only to go somewhere, but it's to come out of something else. What does God tell him? Get thee what? Out of your father's land, away from this. God needed to remove him from this background. Abraham was a godly man, but I think God in looking, saying, it's not good for Abraham to stay here in Haran or in Ur. There's too much idol worship going on, and perhaps relatives, cousins, nephews, whoever else could maybe entice Abraham to sin. And so he calls him away from that area. And as I thought about that, we think God sometimes calls us, doesn't he, in areas that we have problems with? We know in the New Testament, if you look in Mark chapter 10, and starting in verse 17, there's a story here, and it says, "Now as Jesus was going out on the road, one came running and knelt before him and asked him, 'Good teacher, what should I do that I might inherit eternal life?' So Jesus said unto him, 'Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. You know the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and your mother.' And he said unto him, 'Teacher, all these things I've kept from my youth.' Then Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, 'One thing you lack. Go your way, sell whatever you have and give it to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven, and come, take up the cross and follow me.' But he was sad at this word, and he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions." Is possessions a sin? Abraham left with a lot. Abraham, in today's terms, we would have called him a multimillionaire. God let him leave. What was the problem? For Abraham, it was his homeland, wasn't it? God needed to remove him from that. For this young man, it was his wealth. Maybe there's something from us that's keeping us from, you might say, an idol that we need to get rid of. Notice, too, what that Abram does not question God. And I think if I were Abram, God said, Larry, I want you to go, and I'm going to show you where I'm going to lead you to. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of, excuse me, but are there some rest stops along the way? Can you kind of tell me where I'm going? Are there banks, stores? Is the land, is it good land? I want to know a little bit. Can I get some information here? It says, there's no recorded questions of Abraham. I find that remarkable. It says that Abraham sets out for the land of Canaan. And evidently God was guiding him along the way. I'm not sure that he knew exactly where he was going in Canaan when he left. He just had the general idea that this is the general area you're going to. And so we find that as we get on to Genesis 13, and here, and again, I'm not reading all of Genesis, but I'm kind of dealing with these areas that deal with Lot, because as we look at Lot and then we look at Lot's wife, we can kind of get some ideas of how Lot and his wife wound up where they were in the admonition that Jesus gives. In Genesis 13, starting in verse 1, says, Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been in the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also went up with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell. And so as you read the story, you find that the servants of these two, Abraham and Lot, start to quarrel a little bit. There's a little bit of friction there, and Abraham steps in and he takes the first, you might say, the opportunity, and he said, this is not good. This is not. And Abraham, I think, is not only thinking of family relations, but he's thinking of how this looks to the people of the land. So, it doesn't look good for God's people to be fighting. Let's not be doing that. This is a big land. There's a lot of area. And ideally, as the elder, in that time, the patriarch had the right of first choice, so to speak. But he's generous, and he tells Lot, you choose whatever you want. You go one way, I'll go the other, and there's more than enough land here for us. We can solve this peaceably. And it says here that Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw the plain of Jordan, and that it was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plains of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And here you find, I think, probably one of the first steps that brings us to not only the problem for Lot, but for Lot's wife. What's Lot looking at when he makes his choice? There's no indication here at all that Lot prayed, that he sought the Lord's counsel, that he was looking to see where it was best. It says he looked out and he saw the well-watered plain. Now, the Bible tells us later that Lot was if you will, calls him a righteous man. And I'm not sure that Lot in his mind really thought this through. A lot of us don't. We're not inclined to think, well, I'm a selfish guy and I'm going to take the best. I could imagine Lot thinking to himself, well, Uncle Abraham really likes it up here in the hills better anyway. This seems to be the place he's most comfortable, and I've got plenty of land down there. I won't have to intrude on his. And besides, I bet you I could be a good witness to those people in Sodom. There's some rough rascals in there, and they could maybe I could start a branch Sabbath school, you think? We don't know for sure what went on in his mind, but certainly Lot made a choice not based on the best of ideas. And we find that as he's there, and it says, when Lot originally goes, where is he going? It says he's pitching his tents what? Towards Sodom. So he's in that general vicinity, but he's still out of town, a little ways out of town, taking care of the cattle. But in Genesis 14, we find something has changed. And it tells the story of how these kings who had been holding Sodom and Gomorrah, if you will, as tribute cities to them, Sodom and Gomorrah decide they're going to rebel. And so they do. But the kings that were getting tribute from them before decide they're not going to give up their tribute. So there's a battle that takes place. Sodom and Gomorrah lose. Most of their people flee for the hills, and it says that Lot and his family is taken captive. And here we find that you get into verse 11, it says, "Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed." And of course, it says, "Then the one who escaped come and told Abraham the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth tree in Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abraham. Now when Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed the 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods and brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people." Now, I've kind of wondered when you read that, you wonder how did Abraham get outside of the city? Here's Abraham. It says first he's pitched his tent towards the city. And you can kind of imagine that if you think of where Lot grew up, he grew up in the Ur. It was a sophisticated city. And you look at Sodom, and I can imagine maybe Lot thinking, well, it'd be nice to live in a house. This tent living gets a little bit old and seems to be a pretty nice town. A little wicked, but, a pretty nice town overall. But I also wonder, too, because between this time, the next time, of course, we find Lot mentioned with Abraham, we find that Lot's married. And when did he get married? And is it possible that he's married here to a Canaanite woman? Perhaps the reason, in fact, patriarchs and prophets specifically say one of the reasons that Abraham stayed in Sodom was because of his family. But makes you think that perhaps here that Lot has gotten married to a Canaanite woman, and perhaps not a Canaanite woman who wants to become a follower of God. And as we go on a little bit further, it would seem that maybe that is the place. In fact, if you look in 2 Peter 2, verses 6 and 7, where Peter talks about this, he talks about how the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were condemned to be burned to ashes. But if you get down to verse 7, "And he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, and the righteous man living among them day by day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard." So it makes you think that perhaps Lot wasn't overly happy where he was in Sodom. But whatever the case is, we find that Lot has chosen to live in Sodom. And the bigger question comes after all this happens, he's taken captive, he's hauled away, and Abraham comes to rescue him. You would think maybe Lot would decide that it's time to move out of Sodom. You think maybe he might be going, Uncle Abraham, is there someplace up in the hills, maybe a little not too far away, that maybe there'd be some good cattle country up there, some sheep country, that maybe I move a little closer to you, Uncle Abraham? No? Where does Lot go? Right back to Sodom, doesn't he? And so we find here in Genesis 18, and this is quite a few years later, when Abraham and Lot come into the land of Canaan. Abraham is 75, probably a little past that. Most people think a couple of years after he got there, when maybe Abraham was 78 is when Lot and Abraham parted. Well, now as we get into Genesis 18, Abraham is almost 99 years old. Lot's been quite a few years now, close to the land of Sodom and in Sodom. It says Genesis 18, it says, Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground and said, My Lord, if I found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourself under the tree, and I'll bring you a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. And after that, pass by, inasmuch as you've come to your servant. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, Quickly make 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the tent, took a tender and good calf, and gave it to a young man, and hastened to prepare it. Now, did you notice what kind of a host Abraham is? When he stopped by, he said, Well, why don't you just rest yourself? I'll get you a glass of water, and I might read it as a loaf, get you a slice of bread here, give you a little comfort. But what's Abraham preparing? When I read that, someone said it was almost the equivalent of 3 quarts of fine flour to make these cakes that she was going to make in the fatted calf. He was putting on a feast, wasn't he, for these visitors? It says that, so he took butter and milk and the calf, which he prepared, and set it before them, and stood by them under the tree as they ate. Then the men rose from there to look toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on their way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing, since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham that what he has spoken to him. You find here too part of maybe why Abraham stayed but where he's at. But what does God say about Abraham? He says, I know what? He's going to teach his children, but not only his children, what? The household, all those around him. Abraham's going to be a good influence on all those he's around. And the Lord said, Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood before the Lord, and Abraham came near. Would you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Here we find the heart of Abraham. And I can imagine that each day he was praying for Lot, thinking of Lot and the city of Sodom and the evil influences there. And so we find he's bargaining, if you will, with God. Well, God, if there were 100 people in that city, would you destroy it? The 100 people? No. And so we find Abraham going back and forth. He's lowering the numbers. He goes, what he says, suppose there are 50 or even 5 less than 50. Would you destroy it? Well, what if it was 35? Would you destroy it for 35? And of course, God says no. Well, what if it were 20? Would you destroy it for 20? And finally, please don't be angry, but what? Would you destroy it if there were 10 righteous people? And I'm sure Abraham's thinking in the back of his head, well, let's see now, if there's Lot and his wife, the 2 girls, and then he's got these other girls and they're married and the family, let's see, I think there might be 10 people there. Maybe God won't destroy it. And of course, God tells him, he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went on his way, and as soon as he had finished with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Abraham was concerned, wasn't he, for those that were there, and for Lot and Lot's whole family. It says, now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting, this is in chapter 19, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, here, my lords, please turn in your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way. And he said, no, but we'll spend the night in the open square. But he insisted strongly, so they turned in to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Did you ever wonder what would have happened if Lot would not have been persistent? What if when the angel said, well, we're gonna go ahead and sleep in the square on? Lot said, well, yeah, it's your choice. That's fine. Going home. We find here a little bit of Abraham and Lot, don't we? And more than that, the Spirit of God. Lot was concerned about people, and we find him here at the gate. We're kind of given the impression that he was kind of looking for people like that to maybe help out. In fact, Hebrews 13:1 says, let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Wonder if he was thinking of Lot when he penned that verse. We don't know. But I'm sure it's happened at other times too, not only there. And perhaps someday we'll be surprised when we find out maybe something that we considered a very casual meeting, maybe somebody talking to us on the street, or maybe somebody has been helped with a flat tire or something else, that we've been helped by angels unaware too. We never know. As we get into on into the chapter there, we find here how wicked the city was. This is now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, and all the people from every quarter surrounded the house, and they called out to Lot and said to him, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out that we may know them carnally. So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See, now I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you and do with them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since the reason they've come to the shadow of my roof. Even with the hospitality of that time, it's hard to imagine Lot doing that. And sometimes I wonder if Lot's conscience wasn't seared a little bit by living there. I had in college, a friend of mine had bought a house, and it was near the airport, a major airport where a lot of people took off. As I came there in the evening, I was saying, how do you sleep? You're sitting there, it seemed like every 20 minutes, and another plane taking off. He said, I don't even notice it. They'd gotten used to it. It was just part of the everyday mundane thing for him. And it makes you wonder, too, if living in Sodom, and we find out as we look at his family, that it was having an effect. Even if inside of his home, Lot was worshiping God, even if inside of his home he was doing everything that God asked for him to do, the outside influences were creating effects that were going to be difficult to eradicate. And of course, as we get to the bottom here, it says, and they said, stand back. Then they said, this one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as judge, and we will deal worse with you than with them. So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door. And I heard somebody mention that perhaps this was even a little beyond what we think of just regular blindness, because if you're blind, you can feel your way to something, can't you? But it was almost like it had affected their mind so that they're thinking this table is over here, but as they're going for it, they're so messed up visually in how they see things that even feeling and perception would not lead them to the door. And we're told in Ezekiel that that Sodom, it says here in Ezekiel 49 and 50, it tells us a little bit more about Sodom. It says, look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. You ever heard the term idleness is the devil's workshop? Evidently, it seems to be here. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor or the needy, and they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore, I took them away as I saw fit. Sodom had a lot of problems, didn't it? Does sin usually just encompass one thing? You know, sometimes in the New Testament it talks about sin being leavening. What happens to leavening if you put it in a loaf? Does it stay in one little tiny part? You put it over here and you look and there's this nice flat piece of dough, but over here in the corner there's just this little tiny place, right? And so we find that Sodom, as this started to grow and expand, that the multitude of sins got to be more and more. And so God has said, now it's time to destroy the city. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city? Take them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the outcry of them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters and said, get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But to his sons-in-law he seemed to be joking. They weren't too closely connected, were they, to the God of Abraham? You might say they laughed it off, told him to go home. They may have probably told him he was drunk or maybe a little out of his mind, who knows what. It says, when the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. So it came to pass that when they brought him outside, he said, escape for your lives, do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain, escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. Can you imagine Lot's there, and it says they tarried. They weren't wanting to leave, were they? In fact, it sounds as if the angels had to almost, if by force, drag them out of the house and out to the plain before they tell them to flee. And Lot said to them, please no, my lords, indeed now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased your mercy, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now, this little city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Please let me escape. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. And he said to him, see, I have favored you concerning this thing also, and I will not overthrow this city for which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive. Therefore the name of the city was called Zor. And you find here multiple times now the grace of God, don't you? Some people say, well, the grace of God doesn't show itself in the Old Testament. But with Abraham, can you imagine a CEO of a large company if you question him 4 or 5 or 6 times? Whoa, what about? What about? How many of them would lose their temper? And yet we find the God of the universe as Abraham's talking to him and saying, please, how about? And God's patient and kind, listening to Abraham. He said, I know why you're doing that, Abraham. I know you love Lot. And even here for Lot, God's willing to listen to his plea. It says, the sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zor. Then the Lord rained fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So he overthrew those cities, all the plain and the inhabitants of the city and what grew on the ground. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, have you ever wondered why? Does that seem a little harsh for just looking back? Say, well, all she did was turn her head a little bit. I think it was much more than that. In fact, if we read through part of what we read this morning for the memory text, it says, "As was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, as it was in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so it will be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day, he who is on the household or housetop, and his goods are in the house, let him not come down to take them away. And likewise, the one who is in the field, let him not turn back. Remember Lot's wife." What were these two group of people mentioned here doing? What were they going to do? One was going to go from where? He said, don't do what? Go from the top of your house? Go back inside to grab your valuables. Don't do it. You're out in the field, what? Don't go back. God wasn't talking about looking. It makes me think that Mrs. Lot was turning around to head back to Sodom. That's where her heart was. She couldn't bear to give it up. This was her people. This was the home. You can imagine she's saying, look at all we've worked for. All this wealth we have, that fine home. My daughters are there, my family, my relatives. This is the home I love. I'm not going to leave it. I'm going back. Because the context of what we're reading here in Luke is not one that turned their head slightly to leave as they were heading to flee. And so as we read here, and God is talking about remember Lot's wife, and you know what happened to Lot's wife wasn't something that happened in a second. How long did it take for Lot's wife to come to the point where she was at? Did the love of the city occur overnight? Happens over quite a while, doesn't it? And you find, like the young man that Jesus is talking to, this is what he had put his life into. And you can see him, he's saying, you know, I'm willing to, I'll keep the Sabbath, Lord, no problem with that. I'll be nice to my neighbors, but I've worked so hard for this, Lord. I can't give that up. I just can't give that up. Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on the earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And you find that when we look at Abraham and he's called the father of the faithful. Do you think it was a little difficult for Abraham? Here he is, he's 75 years old. I would hate to go somewhere where I've never been before and start over. But we find Abraham willing to give it up, and I'm quite sure he would have been willing to give up the wealth that he had too if God would have required it. Abraham had his sights set on something else, didn't he? He had a different goal than just the wealth. There was nothing wrong with the wealth, or God wouldn't have allowed him to have it. He was a very wealthy man, but that wasn't Abraham's focus in life. But for Lot's wife, that city, her possessions were her focus in life. That was her whole life, and she couldn't bear to be taken away from it. In Matthew 24:11 through 13, it says, "Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved." How is it that lawlessness causes the love to grow cold? Well, I think in Mark Jesus gives us a little bit of an example. In the parable of the sower, he talks about the seeds, but some of the seeds fall in the thorns. You remember that story? It says, now the ones sown among the thorns are the ones who hear the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desire for other things entering in choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. How do we get to where we want to turn back? It's our focus, isn't it? I think that's what God's saying. Remember Lot's wife. Her focus was on the wrong thing. Her life was bound up, not necessarily that it was bad. There's nothing wrong with children, nothing wrong with a home, nothing wrong with wealth. Abraham had that too. But for Lot's wife, that was her life. God wasn't her life, but her possessions. All of that encompassed the whole of her life, and without it, life wasn't worth living for her. And so I think that's what God's saying to us. Remember Lot's wife. If you don't want to be Lot's wife, start working today to make your focus. Nothing wrong with some of the other things in life. We have to work. Abraham worked. Lot worked. Even the time of Jesus, Jesus had a job to do as a carpenter. But for none of those, God's champions, if you will, those things were not the first priority in life. God was. And so that's what God, when he tells us, remember Lot's wife, he's telling us, make sure your focus correct. Keep your mind on him and keep your focus on God, and the rest of the stuff will fall into place, won't it? If he's our first priority, nothing wrong with some of the rest of it, but God's our first priority, the rest of it will fall into place. And the closing song, Nearer, Still Nearer, isn't that what we want God to be?